There is a very specific, deeply misunderstood joy in a canceled plan. For a certain type of person, seeing that text doesn't bring a wave of disappointment. It brings a profound, physical sense of relief. Suddenly, the evening stretches out before you, empty, quiet, and entirely yours. You didn't do anything wrong. You didn't have to be the one to say no, but you get the ultimate prize, your own time back. If you are someone who actively looks forward to doing absolutely nothing with absolutely no one, society has probably made you feel a little bit broken. People look at you and ask, "Don't you get lonely?" Or "Aren't you bored?" They look at your weekends spent entirely alone in your apartment and they see an empty room. They assume that if you aren't talking, texting, out at a loud dinner, or constantly moving, you must be depressed, antisocial, or missing out on the best parts of life. But from your point of view, the room isn't empty at all. It is loud, vibrant, and incredibly busy. You just happen to be the only one in it. Welcome to the hidden psychology of the self-sufficient introvert. Today, we are going to look under the hood of your human design. Let's talk about why your brain doesn't need a crowd to feel completely alive, and why your capacity for solitude is actually a biological masterpiece. To understand the self-sufficient introvert, we have to look past personality tests and look directly at your starting stats, your neurochemistry. For extroverted people who require constant external stimulation, the brain's reward center relies heavily on a neurotransmitter called dopamine. Dopamine is the go-get-it chemical. It rewards risk, novelty, loud noises, and meeting new people. For an extrovert, a crowded, chaotic room feels like a biological winning streak. Their brain is functioning exactly how it was designed to. But you drew a different ticket in the birth lottery. Your nervous system is fundamentally wired to prefer a completely different neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is also tied to pleasure, but a very different kind. It rewards deep thinking, reflection, intense focus on a single task, and internal synthesis. But here is the catch. Acetylcholine pathways operate at their absolute best in quiet environments. When you put an introvert-wired brain into a loud, highly stimulating environment, it isn't just annoying, it's biologically overwhelming. Your threat detection system starts firing because you're taking in too much sensory data, and your brain is struggling to process it all at once. You aren't antisocial. Your hardware is simply designed to process the world internally rather than externally. Your brain is a nuclear reactor. It generates its own power from the inside out. You don't get bored when you're alone because your mind is already engaged in a brilliant, complex conversation with itself. This biological design was there from the very beginning. Let's rewind the tape to when you were a kid. You were probably the child who could play alone for hours. You created elaborate imaginary worlds. You could get lost in a book or a solitary hobby and emerge half a day later, barely aware that any time had passed. You were perfectly content. But adults often look at a quiet, self-sufficient child and panic. They interpret internal focus as a social deficit. They worried you weren't developing social skills. Your teachers wrote on your report cards that you needed to participate more or come out of your shell. You were pushed into group projects, forced into team sports, and constantly encouraged to be louder, more visible, and more engaged. And that's exactly when the shame started. That is when you learn that society views your natural baseline as a flaw that needs to be fixed. You are taught that a rich inner life is somehow less valuable than visible external activity. So you learn to mask. You learn to put on what we call the extrovert suit. As an adult, you probably have the extrovert suit perfectly tailored. You know how to be charming. You know how to hold a conversation, make people laugh, and navigate a crowded room. People who meet you might not even believe you're an introvert because you perform the role so well. But performing is exactly what it is, and performing is cognitively expensive. When you're out in the world, you have to hit pause on your internal reality to match someone else's external pace. You have to monitor social cues, track multiple overlapping conversations, and suppress your instinct to retreat and process. While you can do this, it costs you a massive amount of energy. This is why after a weekend of socializing, even with friends you genuinely love, you experience what feels like a physical hangover. You feel lethargic, irritable, and completely drained. Your battery is in the red. You aren't depressed. You're just experiencing the biological cost of running your engine on the wrong fuel for too long. Solitude is the only place where you don't have to translate yourself. It's the only place where you can finally take the extrovert suit off and let your nervous system return to baseline. Because society misunderstands your need for solitude, they also completely misunderstand how you handle relationships. There's a myth that self-sufficient introverts want to be alone forever. That's not true. You crave connection just as much as anyone else, but your definition of intimacy is different. You value depth over breadth. You'd rather have 2 friends who understand the darkest, most complex parts of your mind than 50 acquaintances you have to make small talk with. For you, the highest form of intimacy isn't constant conversation. It's parallel play. It's the ability to be in the same room with someone you love, both doing your own thing in complete silence. No pressure to entertain, no pressure to perform. Just the quiet, steady anchor of another person's presence while you both explore your own internal worlds. If you can sit in silence with someone and not feel the desperate urge to fill the air with words, that's how you know you have found your people. We live in a culture that's terrified of silence. We pathologize boredom and worship busyness. Society tells you that if you spent the entire weekend alone, thinking, reading, or just existing, you wasted your weekend. But history and psychology tell a completely different story. Deep work, creative breakthroughs, and profound self-awareness do not happen in the middle of a noisy crowd. They happen in the quiet. When you allow yourself to be alone, you're not hiding from reality, you're processing it. If you are someone who never runs out of things to think about, if you find that a quiet house is the greatest luxury on earth, you are not broken. You didn't fail at being social. You succeeded at being self-sufficient. You don't need to force yourself to crave the spotlight. You don't need to apologize for wanting to leave the party early. And you certainly don't need to pretend you're lonely just to make other people feel comfortable. You have built a world inside your own mind that is safe, complex, and deeply engaging. That isn't a deficit in your human design. That's a superpower. So the next time someone asks you, "Don't you get bored being all by yourself?" just smile, because they simply don't have the passcode to the world you're living in.